so much for having me.
I love to hear it. New friends and old, welcome, welcome.
Yes.
Alexa, I'm
Yeah.
so excited to talk to you today because I've
Of
really
course.
been in all of my content, really talking and posting a lot about property and divorce. And the two of us, we've briefly connected
Yes.
previously and then realized there was so much information of what you do that's of value to a lot of my followers and a lot of my clients. So I'm so happy that you're here today. Thank you so much for giving your time. And I have a couple of questions I'm going to go through. I was just reminding the audience, I anticipate this conversation will last about 20 minutes. I do have some questions, but if anyone who is joining us live has a question, please feel free to drop it in. I will get to it. And so with that, I'm just going to kind of, again, say hello and welcome. And I think the first thing I'd love to be able to kind of dive into, Alexa, is what is a CDRE? Like, what is the definition of that position and what does that person do?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, let me start by saying thank you so much for having me. I'm grateful to be here and for everyone who's tuning in. So it's interesting, right? Like in every industry that we go to, we look at attorneys, and you don't. It's not very often that you come across an attorney who's like, I do everything. You don't typically go to a doctor who's like, hey, I do everything. Typically, the best ones are going to be specialists in something, right? So like, you're not going to go to a foot doctor for heart surgery. Like that would just be bananas, right? Like you're not gonna call an environmental attorney for a family law issue. Real estate really needs to become and is becoming very much the same way. And so when we look at divorce real estate, it's actually one of the most complicated transactions that we can have. And so when we sort of factor in the complexity of the transaction itself, and then we factor in the emotional sort of complexity and depth that comes into it, it's so important to deal with an expert here. And so I think to answer your question, we really have to start with the sort of our training and how we sort of become a CDRE. So there are a handful of certifications that you can get that make you sort of a divorce specialist, if you will. However, what you'll find is that most of the certifications are like a 2 to 4 hour sort of online training, and they're like, okay, finish it, and woohoo, you get, a certificate, and you get to put some letters behind your name. Whereas in the CDRE program, so Certified Divorce Real Estate Expert, we're actually trained by family law attorneys, and it's a 3 month super intensive, super hands-on sort of experience where in order to even get into the program, you actually have to demonstrate a proven track record of being able to help clients. You have to demonstrate expertise. We learn how to testify on the stand. We dig into like the divorce finance aspect of it. And so, down into even the family law community looks at us as the true experts. We do what's called continuing legal education for family law attorneys. We look at case studies every month. So when you're dealing with a CDRE, you're not just dealing with like someone who just took a class and gets to put some letters behind their name. Like we truly are experts in this space. And so I think that's the first part of it. And the second part to answer your question that I think is super important is when we look at like a general agent, one of the really common sort of things I hear from clients is like, I love my agent, right? And rightfully so. Like I'm in South Florida. We have by and far the most competitive real estate market in the country. There's 90,000 of us in 3 counties. And so everybody here, knows 10 agents, right? So like that's not a surprise. But the reality is when you try to put a sort of general agent into a divorce transaction, what you're going to find is that your typical sort of general agent is really good at their job when everybody's on the same page. But now you throw in restraining orders and court orders and all this other stuff, and all of a sudden, it's not really the same experience that you were expecting. And so, I get it. Like I have agent friends that I adore to death. Like if I wasn't in the business, I would refer them. And yet we also have to understand that the expertise that comes in is super important. We're talking about high conflict. We're talking about a really sensitive transaction where we don't want to, put the sign in the yard before you've told your kids that you're getting a divorce and you're going to be selling. We don't want to accidentally shoot ourselves in the foot where an agent puts like, hey, this is a divorce listing in the description, which then ends up negotiating against you. And then even something as simple as, you know, your agent is like, hey, I just want to like build a relationship with your attorney, and they're emailing them every second and they're hopping on calls because agents by nature are super social. And now all of a sudden you're like, why is my attorney bill so
Yeah.
expensive? Right? So it's all of those things. So I know that was a really long-winded answer, and yet to be thorough, I had to give you all of that. So I hope that that sort of answers it for
I
you.
will take it all. I love it. It's all so valuable. Thank you. And you did mention, working with the CDRE can happen at different points,
Yes.
whether it is somebody who is assigned to you by the courts, whether it's somebody that a divorce attorney brings in as kind of a neutral third party who works for the divorce as opposed to one spouse or the other, or even in mediation. So if my question then would be, let's say you're about to head into a divorce, you do have property, one, multiple, whatever it might be. Is a CDRE somebody who you can seek out on your own before even talking to a divorce attorney or a mediator when you're really, what I lean into, which is preparing in advance of the process so that you're really educating yourself, getting all of your ducks in a row before kind of taking your next steps, so you have everything necessary in hand to really move forward, save time and money, and make smart choices
Yes.
because you're educated. Can somebody come to you that early in the process?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, it's pretty common that we unfortunately end up knowing about divorces way before they ever even get initiated. And yet, as part of our code of ethics, we are held to a very high standard. So you mentioned that we are a neutral third party. And so that neutrality aspect is super important and is to the benefit of everyone involved, because if the opposite spouse feels like, you know, the agent's taking one side, that opens up a whole separate can of worms. So even regardless of when a party comes to us, we always act as that sort of neutral. But absolutely, come to us the second that you're thinking about it. And I think the other aspect of it is a lot of times people think like, I can only reach out when I'm ready to sell. But the reality is, when you should be reaching out is when you're like, I'm not sure if I want to sell or not. Because if you come to us that early, we can connect you with, so the CDRE is the Certified Divorce Real Estate Expert. There's also something called a CDLP, which is a Certified Divorce Lending Professional. So think of a lender that specializes in divorce. And so, you know, technically you might be able to qualify to be able to keep the property, but between, you know, our sort of perspective and the lender perspective, and if you really want to take it up a notch, we can also talk about the CDFA, which is a Certified Divorce Financial
Yeah.
Analyst. And so really leveraging the expertise of all these different people from different perspectives, you're going to get a really holistic view on, if you decide to keep the property, what that's going to look like, if you decided to sell, what that's going to look like. And you've alluded to now a couple of times, you know, even looking at multiple properties, we also have to factor in things like the tax
Yeah.
implications of, you know, if you are selling a property and you have, you know, a seven-figure sort of takeaway after the sale, and then on investment properties, being able to sort of factor in the tax aspect of that as well. And so the earlier the better. Like, let us help you put the plan together, and you'll just have so much more peace of mind.
It's incredibly, incredibly rich what you just gave us in terms of information about the process and other people to be able to engage alongside a CDRE. I want to kind of talk about something you just mentioned, but also, bring it back to something we started with, which is when you're going through a divorce, even before, if you're just investigating things and you're dealing with family property, especially if it's the family home, a lot of big emotions can be
Oh,
triggered.
yes.
Fear, financial stress, as well as if you even have children. Well, I've built my whole life around this, perimeter, like this area, and this is where the house is. And you can't perhaps reimagine like up and moving. And also,
Yes.
quite frankly, with the way interest rates are now,
Mhm.
perhaps you locked in back in the day at a really great rate and you're not willing to give that up. So part of that is A, yes, educating yourself. And B, what I love that you shared is that when you reach out to a CDRE, they can then connect you with a CDLE, the lending expert, somebody who is very experienced of working with people going through the divorce process. And one thing I would also say is when we were talking about multiples is everything's a negotiation. So when you are getting the appraisals, the market values of the different properties, as well as looking at, as you mentioned, all the different costs associated with those properties to make your decision, perhaps you're going to come out on the side of a sale makes the most sense, or maybe you'll, if you have multiple properties, there's a trade. You take this, I take that. That's one thing I really want people to remember. Everything's a negotiation. Things aren't, black and white and set in stone as to how things get to go. Each divorce gets to be its own thing. And then jumping back to kind of the process, I love that you can engage somebody even if you're just thinking about a divorce and you're really educating yourself. And then the other ways that you mentioned of working with the CDRE are you can be hired by a divorce attorney, family law attorney, or a mediator, or appointed by the court. If
Right.
if someone is appointed by the court, can you give a little bit of a background of what that experience, what that process is like?
Yes, I can absolutely do that, but I think we should take it back just one step to talk about sort of the difference between mediation and litigation in divorce and how that shows up in the real estate transaction. So,
Great.
think and I think that that's a super important distinction here because when we look at from the mediation aspect, like we especially, collaborative divorce comes up a lot in the mediation side. So when we think of the collaboration side, we're all sort of on the same team. We're working towards the same goal, right? Like it's not one party trying to sabotage the sale because they're not ready to make that move. It's everybody working towards the same goal. And so like that's obviously the ideal situation. It's going to be a cheaper divorce that way. It's going to be easier on your family. It'll be mentally, emotionally, financially, all of those things easier.
Yeah.
On the opposite side, though, when there is litigation involved, granted, we are trained in dealing with both of these. So it's not like, we only do one or the other. But when we are factoring in sort of the litigation side, we are looking at court orders and we're looking at lots of back and forth with the attorneys, which is going to really just make that more expensive. And so with that in mind, the CDRE can be appointed by the court. And the important thing I think to know about the sort of court order is the court can decide a lot of different factors. They can say, this is who the agent's going to be. They can even, specify down into how much the property sold for, how long it has to sit on the market. And
Wow.
truthfully, attorneys do incredible work in their specialty, but they're not in the real estate business every single day. And so sometimes the court order actually ends up hurting us a little bit more than helping us just because there is a lack of sort of relevant up to date sort of market information in that court order. So let's say, for example, we get appointed. It can happen sort of one of two ways. Either the client reaches out directly and they say, okay, you were appointed to my case. In a lot of cases, the attorney will, send over an email with the court order that says you've been appointed. At that point, especially, we'll take the litigation route. So assuming neither party is talking to each other, and we're going to sort of take that, right? So at that point, we do two separate sort of initial intakes. We look at individual but equitable sort of communication. We want to make sure that, we're not putting either party in a situation where they have to be on the phone with the other party at any point in the transaction. And yet, as part of being that neutral sort of third party, we make sure that, we are sort of keeping that communication open on everything that's relevant to the transaction. So neither party can ever say, well, hey, my agent's taking one side or the other. So we do the initial intake. From that point, will go and actually see the property. In a lot of cases, especially in litigation, one of the parties hasn't been in the property for a long time. And so we will take photos for what we call the outspouse. So in-spouse is the person living in the house, outspouse is the person who's not living in the house. And just so that they can see, kind of the condition of the property. And that really helps us sort of guide the pricing conversation. And at that point, and of course, if there's any like sensitive, things that you don't want photographs, obviously we will respect that. But essentially, we need to make sure that the outspouse understands the condition of the property and really what we're working with. At that point, we will do two separate listing consultations. We look at, everything down into it. We even pull like a preliminary lien search to see if there's any sort of liens against the property that will affect the payout of the property at closing. Because if, let's say, for example, there's, a child support, judgment, and there's tax judgments and all these things against the property, and you thought that you were going to be walking away with a six-figure take home, and now all of a sudden you're like, well, there's all these judgments against the property and all these liens, and now we're
Mm-hmm.
actually only walking away with 25,000. Like, you want to know that ahead of time, not in the last second, right? And so we do the listing consultation, we sort of make our recommendations, pricing, repairs to the property, all the good stuff. And at that point, once we've had the consultation with both parties, we've sort of come to terms on pricing. We send over the listing documentation, we get ready, to get the property on the market. And at that point is when, we start the process.
That is incredible. Thank you so much. You really gave us such a detailed breakdown of what to expect. That was so thorough. I'm hesitating on saying your name only because somebody in my room
Yeah,
has the
don't.
same name.
I will tell
And they
you.
will
So
start talking.
a little off topic here, but during the pandemic, so everybody at that point had one, right? Had my name. And so I chaired a nonprofit organization. And so I never realized how much people started a sentence with my name. I have a question until COVID, because it would be like, my name, I have a question. And then you would watch everybody go like this off camera. Yeah, because of my name. So definitely don't.
I love it. I love it. Well, going back to that wonderful breakdown, I am gonna put that in detail once this conversation is put up on the blog. It's going to be on my IG page immediately after we wrap today. But I always love to put these interviews on my blog and kind of delve into a little more detail of what was discussed. One of the things you brought up, I think, is really important, which is having a real understanding of the hard costs of divorce, no matter what process you choose. I just posted the most recent blog post is all about what it costs to get divorced in the US in 2024. So for anybody listening or watching, please head over to my blog. The link is in my bio, The Divorce Planner, and check it out. And having a CDRE is a part of that. So to that, what costs can the consumer, the people you're working with on a property, expect to incur from working with a CDRE?
Yeah, totally. So commission is something that is going to depend on the agent. I can tell you personally, and for most of my CDRE counterparts, we don't charge a premium for handling divorce transactions. And so, I mean, I think that is one of the things that people think, like, well, if she's a specialist, it must be insanely more expensive. We're not. We just have specialized knowledge. We have a divorce specific listing process that and we have the skills, right? And so we can get a divorce transaction done in the same amount of time as a traditional
Yeah.
transaction because of all those tools and resources. But there's no additional premium on sort of the transaction just because it's a divorce listing.
That's great. So it's almost painless in a way, because what you're paying is going to be coming out of the sale of the property, which is great. So just for anybody who's thinking about, listing a property and moving forward with a CDRE, just earmark that. One of the best things you can do is kind of go through all of the expenses that are associated with the divorce process, and honestly, when it comes to selling the property or the family home, I think a lot of people forget about certain expenses that are a part of that when they take that expense, that huge asset expense, into consideration should they choose to keep it. And I know that even based on that glorious breakdown of your services. You know, as you said, you are a neutral third party. So any work you're doing on behalf of really the divorce itself, as opposed to one spouse or the other. I love that you hit on the point that, you know, you don't want to be in a position where one spouse thinks things are unfair or skewed towards the other spouse. The truth of the matter is, equity is the name of the game when it comes to divorce. Sometimes when we don't like what we hear, we tend to feel a little slighted. That's the emotional side of what you're going to. My whole coaching practice is built on the idea that there's an emotional side to divorce and there's a business side. You need to separate the two.
Yeah.
And like no other area in divorce, aside from children, comes as close to
Yes.
having this real emotional, you know, kind of intertwined experience when you're dealing especially with the family home. So please make sure, for everybody who's joining us today, if you are considering a sale or potentially buying out a spouse on somebody on your family home or a property, that you take the time to identify if you're having an emotional trigger. Why do you want to keep the property so much? Ask yourself that. Why do you want to sell so much? Make sure you are making a decision based on fact and not feeling, because you know nothing will lead you down the wrong path and like not making financially sound decisions. We
Yes.
just got a question dropped in. CDRE, where can I take that course? Asking how they can, how can they get certified the same way you are?
Yeah, so definitely an agent asking that. Yep. So through the Alumni Institute, so there's a super, super detailed application process. It's an incredible program and incredible community. But definitely, if you want to send me a message, I can get you more details about that.
That's great. And I'm going to be making sure that her account is tagged on this post immediately after we conclude. And just, I know we're already past the 20-minute part, but I had a couple of other things, if you have a second, that I'd love to
Yeah,
be able to
sure.
continue to go through. So what are some common mistakes that you find people make when they are considering selling or keeping the family home in this kind of divorce dynamic, that maybe if you share, some people can avoid making them?
Yes, I think you touched on most of it in the emotional aspect, right? Like most of the time when we allow our emotions to make the decisions is where we really get ourselves into trouble. A lot of times what we'll find, again, we use the example of the in-spouse and the out-spouse, the person who's living in the property, and when we talk about emotions, it's not typically like spite. It's a lot of times it's fear,
Yeah.
right? Like, I don't know where I'm going to go after this. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep my kids in the same school. I don't know if I'm going to be able to afford to live somewhere else, right? So it's all of these things that we have to make decisions based on strategy, not based on our emotions. And so these are all the factors that you sort of gain when dealing with an expert, whereas in a general agent is not just they're just not going to know how to handle those situations. So when we get into the sort of the emotional depths of it, we're trained to handle that. When we're dealing with a high conflict personality, we're trained to handle that, right? Like, so none of this stuff comes as a surprise to us, and we have a whole family law community backing us up. So in the event that there is some sort of situation that we've never seen before, we have an entire community to lean on to come up with solutions that are sort of out of the box. The others that I'll sort of touch on here are, again, like when you're selling your property and it's as a result of a divorce, you definitely want to make sure that the property is not being marketed as a divorce listing.
Yeah.
That is super important, and especially because you may not see it on the front end of your listing. You may not see it on Zillow. You may not see it there. But when you go into, like here in South Florida, we have what's called the broker remarks. It's the section of the listing where only agents can see. And I actually posted a reel a couple weeks ago about how many listings will say seller is motivated. And so we do not use any form of language that would end up sabotaging the sale. So we have that aspect. We have, again, factoring in, like, we're very sensitive to, you telling your kids and telling your family, making sure that the property shows well. And I think the last sort of mistake, especially as we start to see the market shifting in a lot of places. So, like here in South Florida, our condo market is now officially in a buyer's market.
Mhm.
Our single family market still in a seller's market. And so, pricing the property accordingly based on the market of today, not based on the market of 2 years ago, is super important, just because we are experiencing that market shift. And so that one I cannot stress enough.
That's so helpful. Thank you. If someone is interested in working with the CDRE, how do they find you?
Yeah, I'm happy to drop the link for that. Here, I'll actually put that in the
Great.
chat here. So, and for anyone listening afterwards, it's alumniinstitute.com/directory. It is an amazing community of agents. And again, amazingly trained and really wanting to help. Like there, all of us have a story related to divorce and how we got into this space. And so you're truly dealing with an expert. You're not just, it's not just a realtor. You're dealing with a divorce expert, just like yourself.
Well, this makes me so happy also when I went through my own divorce, which was kind of the impetus of me like finding this whole passion and purpose with divorce preparation coaching, which I love. So much has changed, right? So much has been made a lot more easy to access for people going through a divorce than it used to be. CDREs, working with a CDRE, finding information in meaningful ways in advance so that people don't feel as kind of beholden to the legal system to make decisions for them. So if you are in this position where a divorce or separation are on the horizon for you, please take a minute and educate yourself and prepare in advance. Not only will it put you in a great position to save time and money, but you're going to make smart choices and you're also going to become your own best advocate. And to that, Alexa, she's going to say something. I just want to thank you so much for your time. This has been a
Thank
really
you.
insightful conversation, and I hope it's the first of many.
Yes, definitely. Thank you again. I really appreciate you. This was awesome. Anyone listening, if you have any questions, my inbox is open. Feel free to reach out. I'm happy to answer questions. If you're in a different market, I'm happy to make a connection for you as well. So it is my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So great. Thank you so
Awesome.
much. And I will talk to you soon. And thanks to everybody who joined us today. Have a great
Yes.
rest of your day.
You too. Bye bye.
Bye.